Hello, so we're gonna look at this quite difficult game between two players. The black player was rated 200 points higher, and he won this game. But in general, it was quite a difficult defense for white, but he did have some chances. So we will take a look at some critical moments. So the game started out as some kind of English. White eventually opened the center. Queen b6 is one of the moves. The main move here is probably to take, as in general black wants to exchange pieces in these setups, as he has less space, but queen b6 is quite viable. Knight b3 was played, which I guess makes sense, but I don't really like the knight placed here. In general, on these squares, knights don't really like it. Knight c2 is quite a typical response. The knight is eventually going to this d5 square, where it will feel at home. But okay, here queen b4 was played, which is a very daring move. White basically has to play c5, but this move in general is useful for white, as it restricts both d6 and b6. Now, for example, after d6, the structure would be quite bad for black, for example. Black's point was b6, and of course, if he exchanges these pawns, then he will have a majority in the center, while white will have a majority on the queen side. But while there are so many pieces on the board, this isn't very important. White played bishop d2, but I think this is one of the first critical moments. White should have played more aggressively. Black isn't completely developed. His queen is a bit strangely placed, and he can try to use this with the move e4. Now this queen is in some danger, and also this diagonal might get open with this e5, for example, bc, e5. And for example, after knight e5, I mean knight e8, knight d5, white gets some initiative here. It's really not clear what exactly is going on, but for example, queen b8, bishop g5 is a move now. Notice we don't automatically defend this pawn, though bishop f4 is also a move. And white should regain the c5 pawn eventually. He will have the e file if black takes the e5 pawn, and he will have a pretty good position. But this is entirely not easy. So missing this is not very bad. Bishop d2 was played. Black develops his bishop, and now knight d5. So of course, it's tempting to play some kind of open attack against this queen, but fortunately black survives. Knight c7 was played. Probably it was better to include this move, for example here. It's very concrete, but at the end white will regain his piece and he will have a better structure and a rook on the 7th rank probably. So knight c7 was played. And here white kind of got a duel of bishops, the bishop pair advantage, but here it doesn't really matter since one of the bishops is here, which means it will either be very good or white will have to exchange it off at some point, which means his bishop pair will not have a very big effect on this game. So bishop c3 trying to counteract this diagonal, rook d8, cb, queen b6, queen d2, white's finishing development as well, d5 was played, and this is the first kind of moment. It's a bit scary, as it seems that black is trying to take the whole center, which he is, and white should probably try to play with these pawns. But how to do that is not entirely possible, not entirely clear. So firstly, d4 is not really a big issue, as it will open the bishop, and also the bishop still has a square on a5, though not very nice, but it's not a big threat yet. White can still develop like rook ac1, for example, after d4, knight a5, I mean bishop a5, and he can exchange some queens, which is in general useful since he has the advanced majority. And the white should be quite fine here. He's not better, but neither is black. So, but bishop d4, it gives away the bishop, and more importantly, it gives it away while giving away the initiative as well. So I'm not sure until where white calculated here, but it should be quite far, because here The line still continues with e5. They're forcing moves. Black is trying to get his pawn majority going in the center. And white started playing passively. He went back. But knight b5 is a bit better. As he mentioned in the comment. Knight a3, bishop f8. And yes, black is doing better here due to the bad knight and that the majority is not mobile yet. This bishop is quite bad, especially if the pawn goes here. But this is not as bad as in the game. Knight f3. Black played knight d7, which is quite strange. e4 should be played. Of course, this does give up the square for a little bit, but black has a very strong move in knight g4. The point here is that white will basically have to play e3 to defend this knight, and that means this square will be weakened, and that's where the knight will come in. For example, here, knight e5, and go to d3. This bishop is bad, this one will eventually take here, creating a weakness, and black is dominating, since white doesn't really have counterplay with his pawns yet. But knight d7 gave white some chances. But here, rook ac1, although quite natural, it wasn't really called for. White really needs some kind of counterplay, or at least he has to prepare for what black is doing. What is black doing? It's either this, this, or this, right? Probably all of these moves. So he should probably stop something. For example, this. Now e4 isn't too scary, since knight d4 is possible. And in general, white should get his pieces out, especially the bishop. And although the c2 square is covered for now, black's position is not that amazing since the knight doesn't really have a place to go. And white should still hold on. Alternatively, e3, similar ideas. For example, now if knight c4, this isn't very scary because of rook a b1. And although black has some initiative, for example like this, white is still doing quite fine. But here, after e4, suddenly this move knight d4 isn't possible anymore, especially because this rook is attacked. So this was quite important to calculate. Before playing rook ac1, white should really have an idea against e4. Before, e4 wasn't a big issue because of knight d4, but now it is. So e4 was played, white is forced to give up the the c file, played knight d4. Black here took this knight, which gives him a pretty big advantage, but he could have played even better with rook c4 to force the knight off and eventually play rook c2, for example like this. And if knight c3, then just take. And if knight a3, we can go back, and eventually something will give, either the b2 pawn or the knight on a3. And white still hasn't gotten even a bit of counterplay. So knight d4 was played, rook c2. So black decided to get a pawn. But importantly, white does have the bishop, which gives him long-term potential. And now that this pawn will drop after a5, white is not that much worse. So this happened. e3 was played, nice move. If white had taken here, e3 would have been a very strong move by black, threatening this. And even if the white king moves out of the way, knight d2 still wins the bishop as it is trapped. So e3 was essential, and black can't really defend this pawn. So now white is a pawn down, but the pawn on e4 is weak until black hasn't played f5. The passed pawn on a7 is still quite far away, and this knight on a5 doesn't really have a job to do. White's plan is eventually to put the king on g2 and get the bishop out, hopefully attacking f7. That would be the best case scenario. So some moves happened, and eventually white decided to go for the rook endgame, which is probably objectively the best idea. But as we see, white wasn't equipped with enough ideas to hold the rook endgame. So in general, unless we are sure about another endgame being better than what it is here, I wouldn't really go for it. Especially since we again have a bishop for a knight. it's not really worth giving it away unless we got a good reason to do that. For example, bishop c4 is fine, a5, rook d7, knight d6, and for example, bishop f1, rook will hopefully go to a7, and I don't see how black would make progress here. White has a lot of ways to improve the position, for example, g4, g5, put the king on f4, hopefully, maybe h4 at some point. And black's king can't really join the fight as someone has to guard this pawn as well. But this is objectively fine. The rook went behind the pawn, which is in general a good idea. Here probably there wasn't much rush to do that, but it's fine. And here h4 was a bit of a mistake. It's kind of hard to understand this move because it's not like white has to stop g5 right now. He could play g4 himself. The main idea being to stop h5, which would box in this king a little bit. Also, eventually white would love to play g5 to fix this pawn on h7. For example here, king g3 to improve the king. For example here, h4 or even king f4. And eventually, when it comes down to a race where white will have to give up the rook for the pawn, white will have made a lot of progress. As we will see in the game, white didn't manage to make much progress in the king side. So h4, h5 happened, and now white will have difficulties playing g4. And his king will have to come out through here, which is a big journey. So king f1, and slowly black's advantage is getting bigger. King e7, king e2, like this, and then king f1. So a move like king f1 really needs a big explanation. So king f1 is basically like resigning, right? You can't really play moves like this. Black has to make pretty easy moves for himself, and white needs counterplay desperately. So of course king d2. Black can win a pawn, but I don't think exchanging such pawns is that bad for black. I mean for white. Though such an endgame is quite risky. So maybe he can play after the rook b2, king e1 instead. And black will have to defend the pawn again. But king f1 is not great. Now rook e8. So of course black should have went through c6. One reason is that it goes a bit further, and also it doesn't restrict the rook, like this move. Now rook e8 is a nice find. And now black will probably lose one of his pawns. For example, after e5, rook e4, which happened in the game. Otherwise, if f5, then now white has a sort of perpetual check here. And if the king goes here, white can take this g6 pawn. Notice how important it would have been to make some progress on the king side. Now, still black is probably winning, but at least white has some counterplay against these pawns. So black decided to give up the pawn like this, and rook a7, which is in general the right idea, but here black is too slow, and white had the chance to block the pawn with the king. And this is essential in rook endgames. In general, we want our king to make the job of blocking past pawns, not the rook. The rook has to make some kind of active decision, not the king. And here it looks like white isn't in time, but in reality he is, because at the end there will be rook e7 check. So this was very important to calculate. After rook a4, black is winning. But let's look at this. King e2, a4, king d1, or king d2, king c2, and after a7, importantly, this is a draw. Well, not even a draw, white is even winning, because he is a pawn up. So this is very important, and this is one reason king c7 wasn't a good square. White had to find this. Of course, this looks a bit scary, but it's essential to block the pawn with the king. So for example, here king d6, king b1 we can play. And whenever we block it with the king, the chances to hold a draw will rise exponentially. But blocking with the rook is way too passive. As everyone says in rook endgames, the rook should be active. Now the king arrives, and king b3 is a big mistake by black. a4 should be played. There's no reason not to play a4. As they say, passed pawns should be pushed. And the white can't really defend, as his king is not in time to block the pawn. For example, like this, a3 to stop king b2. And if the white rook is forced to block the pawn, then eventually the black rook will come to either attack this pawn or go to b2, or just let the king go to b3. But king b3 was a bit useless because now this is a draw because the king is blocking the path for the pawn. And now white has a lot of time for counterplay, but he has to do it. So white played king c3, which isn't a bad move, but probably it's best to start with e4 and eventually play f4, maybe f3, g4. White really needs a passed pawn. If he can get a passed pawn, he will eventually be able to sacrifice the rook and then get the black rook for his pawn. Of course, that's very general, but that's the main plan for white in these positions. We can see how white didn't really do this, and eventually he ended up lost again. So we walked around. The rook went to b6, but it's unclear what he's doing there. The rook was fine here anyway. King a2, and now rook goes to a6. This move really doesn't help white, as the pawn was gonna go to a3 anyway, and the king was gonna go here, so the rook defending the squares where the pawn will go really doesn't help. The rook was doing a very good job cutting off the king, and in general for black to somehow win this, he would need to play a3 and then somehow put the rook on b2, which will take a while. For example, like this. Let's say white goes for counterplay. Black can try rook c1. And we can try attacking the f7 pawn to create a passed pawn here. Something like rook b1 is way too slow. Rook f7 and king b2, let's say. We can even exchange rooks. And notice how these moves really help. Now even white is close to winning, because in the queen endgame he will have a pawn advantage. So that's one example. White desperately needs counterplay. He cannot just sit and wait, just like in most endgames. Because rook a6, now a3, rook a8, another waiting move. Again, he should either play a e4 or correct his mistake and go here, but probably this is too late. For example, rook c1. Now if we look at the same thing, now white will not be in time to get counterplay. For example, like this. One tempo counts, right? Or for example, if rook b7, just like in that line, now just f5. Since in that line our pawn was on e5. Right? So now it's a bit too late, but still white should try. Rook a8 again gives up a whole move. Now after rook b7, black will just go here, and the game is finished. Well, he decides to realize the advantage like this, which also works. The pawns are just weak, and they will drop off. And it's time to resign, as black is 2 pawns up. So quite an unfortunate game. White was under pressure after misplaying the opening, but he had a lot of chances to survive. The key here was to look for active counterplay instead of sitting and waiting. For example here, starting with this rook endgame, g4 is a nice move to know. Or a few moves later, for example here. If white gets to play this, he won't have much trouble making the draw.